Okay, it looks like we are live again this Thursday evening. Hello, Oakland. It is Council Member Carroll Fife coming to you live and uncut with some of the most pressing issues that are impacting not only my district and District 3, but also the entire city of Oakland. As you all know, we are in the throes of budget season. So I'm sure you're seeing ads on social media, you're seeing us talk about the budget forums that city council members are having throughout the city and just all kinds of things. And one of the things that I've been doing in this budget season is really listening to the constituents of my district and the entire city. And two of the themes that keep recurring are that constituents want to see solutions to homelessness, to the encampments that seem to be popping up all over the city. And my perspective is that in order to address houselessness and in order to address the fact that people need a place to live is to provide housing, right? We have interim solutions that we've discussed, interim solutions that people have tried, but we need long-term solutions to address the crises that we are experiencing right now. So I have two special guests that are going to talk about what's happening in the city. One of them is the interim homelessness director, Latonda Simmons, and she is also the assistant city manager. We don't call them city managers; they're city administrators now in Oakland. But we have her on to talk a little bit about what her role is and what she's doing. And she's a huge resource, not just because of her care and concern about the people, but because she's been at the City of Oakland for a long, long time, knows a lot of things. And even though she's new to this position, she is not new to the politics and what needs to happen in order to actually affect change. So without further ado, I'm going to bring up Latonda Simmons. There she is. Hello, lady.
Hello, how are you?
Girl.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's been a season. I know, Latonda, you're new in this particular position. I'm fairly new to being the assistant city administrator as well, but really new in this position as acting homelessness director. Can you tell people today, what does that mean? What does it entail? And what is your job?
I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about it because, again, it's the homelessness or unhousedness. I don't know if I'm saying it right. Is the biggest issue in the city, one of the biggest issues in the city. So, council made a decision a couple of years ago to establish a position called the homelessness administrator. Now, council's intent was to establish a position that would be a higher level of coordination in terms of the city's response to conditions of homelessness as they exist on the street. And I think somewhere in the distance, just to be very candid, this position was conflated to be, by way of the sound of its title, homelessness administrator, to be the one-stop shop problem solving designation and title in the city. It's garnered much of its reputation from past players who have responded to conditions associated with encampments and individuals that were in public rights of way on the street. But the reality of this work is that it is focused primarily on street response. And it's fortified by a policy that council adopted October 20th, 2020, called the encampment management policy. And one of the things that has continued to really kind of plague the notion of the work is obviously some of the past activities. But just to be very clear, the titles of the director or the homeless administrator seems to lean into it being the kind of work that's supposed to solve the biggest problem in the city. Encampment management is not a housing policy. And it's so very important that we really stabilize the conversation because, as a person that served as a city clerk and I got a chance to listen to a lot of conversations, and words do matter. Words do cast spells. And the art of being able to communicate to people is when you are conveying things that aren't precisely right about a thing, it skews the expectation. it skews the responsibilities that should be aligned with what the titles are. It skews what the resources really need to be, or what the solutions really need to be to address a thing. And I do think that that has primarily happened with the homelessness administrator that supports the work of an encampment management policy. And just by way of the semantics alone, those two things do not align to be solutions to homelessness. And so that said, the position specifically, requires that it coordinate the efforts of what is already an existing interdisciplinary team that will show up and respond to certain circumstances as it relates to homeless individuals or unhoused individuals occupying spaces in the public's right of way. It has a very wide spectrum of criteria, and under the current policy, the policy itself permits a couple of things. One, as a person that's born and raised from Oakland and who's had an unhoused experience more than once, one, it sanctions homelessness, which I think is a very puzzling concept, in that it says that in high sensitivity zones, we don't want encampments, but in low sensitivity zones, we lower the prioritization of addressing those encampments. And while that seems in the order of magnitude based on resources to be sort of the operable logical approach, it just says still that the magnitude of unhoused existence, right, and homelessness is such that this is not a solution. The solution, of course, is housing.
Right.
And that has been made clear when council took the position of adopting a resolution that said that, in the contemplation of closing an encampment, you must make a genuine offer of shelter and or housing to the individuals who are there in the location where you are closing that activity, right? And so what do we know? The story has already been told with respect to the amount of housing stock that we have available. The story has already been told with respect to the amount of shelter beds that are available. And so what does that then do? That actually changes the expectation for what has been blown up to be this grand proliferation of what encampment management was supposed to be. That once adopted and allowed to operate, it was supposed to be this amazing Staples easy button that would be pressed to clear the streets of encampments far and wide. And that's sort of ridiculous in its concept. One, the city doesn't operate sweep teams to pick up unhoused individuals and put them in vans and such and make them disappear. That's inhumane, that's immoral, and that's not anything that I would sign up to do. Two, if we know that housing, shelter, or iterations, and I want to be real clear about that, because the pandemic has taught us something really important, right? That everything that we think is the conventional response for how we ought to respond to a situation really probably needs to be rethought. So there are some immediate things that we can do. It's not in my wheelhouse in terms of certain kinds of interventions that you can stand up so that unhoused people have the ability to live perhaps as they want and under better circumstances with better health and safety. But without those resources, the encampment management policy is stifled. For all of its great intent, or for all of its messaging to be the means by which the city would become cleaner, if we are unable to perform the process of providing housing and shelter to give people real spaces to go, then the encampment management policy begins to fail on its face, because all it will do is scramble people into the wind. We know the county doesn't have more housing slots, and we know the city is grappling with the issue right now. So for me, this is probably the most powerful and most transparent statement that I can really make about the encampment management policy. Now, just for the academic process of talking about what I've done in this role and what I've seen in this role, I'll offer that, yes, I have activated the encampment management policy, but of course, I've activated it with the small footprint of individuals that exist in the departments as they are to support the same level of work with slight changes to how we perform that work. the housing offer being part of the process, right? But specifically, making sure that when I send the team out and when I am out there with them, that we are talking to people in dignity and respect. We are respecting that the position of their agency in that moment is not the accumulation of their worth. And to be mindful that the duty is not to just check the boxes to do a thing, right? But to do this thing in a way that we're actually hopefully not causing more trauma, but hopefully rubricing a process where we get to change the condition of how people may want to live. Now, I want to be very careful about painting with broad brushstrokes here, because everyone probably paying attention and having seen the City of Oakland knows that every person on the street is not in the same place as the next person that you find on the street. The intentions, the circumstances, the impacts are not entirely the same, right? And so this work then has to be calibrated to match even the intensity and the spectrum of intensity when you meet people in these spaces. So what does that mean for me? That means that when I am scheduling an intervention, I am making sure that there have been several conversations, genuine housing offers, and that there's a spectrum of housing available, because I've already heard that some things are simply not suitable to some people. Does it mean that I have a lot? No. Somewhere in the implementation of the encampment management policy, I actually think the city probably would have better served the policy if they had adopted a housing strategy policy. Something that requires immediate interventions, all the way up to shorter midterm interventions, 6 to 8 month build, and then even the contributions of long-term permanent affordable housing. It's that spectrum of housing with an implementation of now and long-term implementation that becomes the important resource for the encampment management policy. And this work cannot be done without that as a resource. So that is what I want to have. If you want data, if you want stats, I can do that. But I thought more than anything, it's important that we put the policy in the appropriate context, and that I show that the reflection of the work that's been commenced since I stepped into the role, by the way, March 8th, 2021, right? Rapid change and rapid learning, that the tone and the intensity of the work is not of heartlessness, of inhumanity and immorality, and even things that contradict the safety. There's a balance to this work, right? Knowing that we don't have a bunch of housing there, this is not a sweep operation. I refuse to impose more trauma on people. I refuse to do that. Knowing that the conditions of the pandemic are easing, yes, I am interested in figuring out how we can deploy more resources to keep the areas clean. And that then probably gives me the great opportunity to talk about what my budget is, right?
Yes, ma'am. I think that is critical because it is budget season. And even outside of budget season, there are funds that exist in other places. Can you speak to what is actually needed? And I do have to bring up this statement from, I think it's all, I hope I'm saying that correctly, that is agreeing with you that this is a spectrum of a housing problem, not just homelessness or an encampment problem. And so the is right there on the screen, because if people had access to affordable housing, then this issue would be a moot issue.
Right.
So when you're put in this position as now the interim or acting homelessness director, that does imply that now we have this position that's going to solve homelessness, but the solution is housing. And so speak to a little bit the resources that are needed for your position, this interim position that you're in, the resources that are needed just to do this particular job in the short term, and then what are the needs in the long term to actually get to the root of the issue?
Thank you. So that is the perfect set of questions, particularly after the context that we've had the chance to set, right? So what are the immediate needs? The immediate needs are to be able to come up with the resources to keep the streets clean, to manage the decompression of certain encampment activities, because while individuals who are unhoused are experiencing and may have debris around them, what I'm finding out is that they're actually being targeted for places where people dump things near them. And then they shoulder this responsibility or being the face of this unprecedented amount of trash and debris. And we know that this is true because when I send teams out to locations to clean near encampments, magically it appears again. And I am pretty certain that the unhoused are not pulling out full-on settees, 2 curios, 3 dining room tables, a love seat, and a full sofa
Right.
every. I
Right.
just so there is another systemic problem happening, and that's the elephant in the room, and that too. Add that to the list to be addressed. Okay. What I have is the Public Works Department, I have the Department of Transportation, I have the Fire Department, I have Human Services, I have on occasion planning and building, and on occasion I have the police department. And I know that that's a sore spot for people, but I'd rather not pretend a thing. Okay. Along with the representatives of myself, one admin assistant, 2, one analyst, we coordinate the higher response, right, of these departments and their dance of going to the street to address conditions, either by way of garbage runs, containerized garbage assignments, porta potties and wash stations, all the way to closures where the health and safety at a particular location balanced with a real and genuine housing offer where something has to be done to close that location, okay? So I have a team of, including the vacant homelessness administrator, 3 people. And so that I can put this in fair context, I know the city cannibalizes a dollar. I'll acknowledge, having been here almost 20 years, that the burden of an FTE is pretty doggone heavy. Okay, so I will not pretend that, right? But here's what I can tell you, that in the time that I've served as homelessness administrator, I have fielded 637 requests to engage encampments. And that's from early March through May. 637 requests. Why? Because some of them are duplicated. The conditions on the street change, right? But the expectation is that we quickly deploy people to assess the situation, abate what we can immediately, work to gain the relationships that we can, make sure that there's housing available, make the housing offer before we have to make a critical decision to close the encampment. So what has happened is myself and I have a gentleman who's actually attending with me tonight, Mr. Amari Collins, and even my admin assistant too, we are often managing and responding and coordinating the response to requests to abate circumstances at encampments, anywhere starting at 5 in the morning to after we get off this meeting, we got some more emails to respond to and some things to coordinate. And that's about 6 days a week when I choose to take a day off.
Right. Right.
What does this work deserve? It deserves more resources, one, to manage this data. And I know that sounds highly administrative, but it also deserves more resources to make sure that we can better manage the dumping that's happening. Yes, there's a culture change and a different thing that has to happen, but it's immoral still to leave trash on the streets. We cannot just say we can't pick up the trash. We cannot just say people deserve to live in squalor. But are we having a hard time keeping up with it? My God, yes.
So there was a request to have you repeat the number of staff you have in relationship to the number of encampments. And there it is from TD Love 5.
Yeah, thank you. 3.
How many people?
3. And I'm serving in the capacity of one of the vacancies. And so on occasion, I may be out in the field. Amari may be out in the field. The admin assistant is sort of working as a dispatch between the departments that I talked about to deploy services, either live time. And you can imagine that with concurrent activities with about, I don't know, we're probably standing at about 150 encampments now. And I'll tell you that I've probably done about 20 closures. But since you don't have resources for everyone and sometimes they decline, you can expect that an individual who may be forced to leave one location is having to show up at another. And so encampments aren't going away without superfluous amounts of housing, right? What's happening is that encampments are being redistributed, and that's the trauma that I work really hard to try to minimize. What we also have as a part of the encampment experience, by the way, are RVs, where they've been given agency during the pandemic because March of 2020, the city issued executive orders that suspended all of the operations, right? One of the things that people don't quite get about why there is such a hard and thick aggregation of activity on the streets is because for almost a year, there was no real encampment management activity happening. The pandemic shut us down. So what did that do? That gave agency to the streets, that fortified things, that lessened the level of management that should have been happening during this time, during the pandemic. And then when we come in January to initiate the process, we're having to abate aggregations of no activity where we didn't have capacity to do so. Because the other part that came with the encampment management policy was not another person and not another dollar.
Well, can you speak to that a little bit more about the encampment management policy? I was not on council when the policy was passed. I believe it was October of 2020. To me, it looked like the criminalization of homelessness, because what it did was determine where people could not be, but did not offer solutions of where people could be. So can you speak to the difference between, because I've also heard that it's not enforceable. So could you speak to the actual legislation and what it authorizes and what it doesn't authorize?
So the resolution that was adopted October 2020, the encampment management policy, it's resolution 88341. What it does is it establishes a policy standard by which these team members will respond to encampment activities on the streets. What it does is it says that in certain areas of the public's right of way, known as high sensitivity zones, closer to schools, closer to churches, closer to businesses, directly in front of residences where the driveways and egress and ingress in and out of the homes are blocked, that encampments should not be. And then it says in lower sensitivity zones, it sort of lowers the prioritization of response to encampments, but still requires that there's health and safety and sort of sanitation being managed at those locations. With 150 locations plus, and I say that because, again, things change constantly. The expectation that we would be able to manage some form of a sweep program to address all of this quickly is really ill-conceived. It's just not possible. And that's probably why the public is terribly frustrated with us. Now, as to the enforceability, it is very clear that under general municipal codes, you typically have codes that say, hey, you cannot be in this place in the public right of way, sleeping overnight, because we have no camping policies, loitering overnight, you know what I mean? Laying, sleeping, and lying overnight. What the policy does not permit, and what it is stalled from doing, and what I should say prohibited from doing, is citing and arresting individuals for sleeping, lying, and being in places overnight. And so this is the hardest part of it. And again, I don't believe in, I just want to be very clear about saying, I'm not one of those people that believes that you should use policy to beat people over the head to manage people. That to me is all a part of the big rubric of systemic racism. So we got to be very, very careful, right, about that, right? But to your point, to have agency where a pandemic has slowed down everything, prohibited us from being able to engage it and manage it appropriately. Also with the lack of housing, I'm sorry, that's my daughter. Also with the lack of housing and shelter resources, we've deployed a policy that moves to enforce, right? Enforce in the sense of telling people they can't be in these places without citing or arresting. But we have not given people a place to go. that is the makings of everything that we know to be systemic racism. It's prompt and primed for that conversation. When you have a community that right now, Oakland knows it's the soundbite through this entire city where the face of the community is disproportionately represented as Black people on the street, 70%. And that's from the point in time count that we were able to do when we were able to do it. We've not been able to do a point in time count based on the pandemic. When you're leading with the community that already has been marginalized onto the streets with an enforcement policy, a policy that says get up and go, that's actually not a problem-solving policy. That is a trauma-based policy.
That's right.
And so I've had to be obviously
I'm sorry. You have to repeat that again because that was classic. Say that again.
I won't be popular for it. I just want to be real clear. But when you are addressing a community that has been impacted by trauma, that is living in trauma, and you are not leading with resources, but in fact, you are authorizing the use of a trauma policy and enforcement policies that says get up and go, you can't be here, then you are perpetuating trauma, and it smacks of the thing that we are talking about with respect to equity and addressing systemic racism. It's just flatly what it is. And this is the work that the government needs to do about being thoughtful about how it uses policy. Now, I'm here, it's my duty, and I have had to be very forensic about how we go about working from location to location with a very low amount of housing available.
I hear you. I salute you. I want to take a couple questions. There's a statement here from Bobby Lopez that says, I would follow Latonda to the end of time. But again, we need to resource our city staff to be successful in addressing our homelessness crisis. I think that
I
was
appreciate that.
Yeah.
Good to see you, Bobby.
I think one of the pandemics that we're experiencing is this crisis of housing. And I will say also for the record, as we wrap and we bring up our next special guest, that it is, you can directly parallel the challenges that Oakland is experiencing around housing and directly connect that to the issues that Black people have had being housed in America since emancipation. And that's just the reality. How wealth was stolen, how land was stolen. We just passed the anniversary of the Tulsa massacre, where land and real estate and wealth was literally stolen from Black people, and that's
still held.
Thank you.
And still held. Mm-hmm.
Still held. And so there are aspects of that in every urban center. We can find some way that housing was taken from community. And we're experiencing that now. And until we have a solution that actually addresses racial inequities, then we're going to continue to perpetuate this issue. And I see that done even with our solutions, because a lot of the people that I've seen being assisted with actually being placed in housing are not Black folks. And so, you know, that's, I'm not saying that to point the finger at anyone outside of, this is a systemic issue that needs a systemic, and as you said, forensic solution. Are there any questions, Mari, that we can ask for Ms. Simmons before she heads out? And I want to say thank you. This has been a great conversation.
And can I make one statement?
Of course.
One little statement. Thank you so much.
Of course.
So this is the place where the adoption of the encampment management policy, touted as something well-intentioned, has to be reconsidered in this context, right? It's not that the city doesn't want to address encampments the right way, right? The question is, what is the right way? And this is where the Department of Race and Equity, in terms of the recommendations that I'm going to be building with them, that addresses how we need to look at this from a very deep sense of operational, the operational framework. It has to be part of the conversation and part of the deployment of readdressing how the encampment management policy will probably need to be calibrated again to be sensitive to this and aligned with the resources that I'm really hopeful that I can begin to see coming into fruition. And I just want to end with one last statement of saying thank you for your leadership as you have focused on coming up with immediate solutions in your district. I'm hoping that energy catches across the city. We need now action as much as we need future action, because the CDC and anything else that we call a policy should not intend to be the instrument by which people die on the street. And so I thank you for your leadership, and I thank you for saying we got to do something now, because I agree.
Oh my goodness, we're supposed to end. That was powerful. That was powerful. But I see this this little lady, Miss Lady, dropped another question in the chat. So Tanya Love is saying, what is the homeless budget request, and how can the public help you get what you need?
The homeless budget request right now, because I don't want to be top heavy, is to add a couple of more people to manage the data and the routing of departments. So I've asked for a couple of positions to be able to better fortify our responses to the public, because I think they need better real-time responses. But let's be honest, what we need to also add is some emphasis on the public works budget, making sure that the teams that go out there and perform the work of keeping the streets clean, even without shutting down an encampment, they need to have more support and more resources to be able to do what it is that they do. It's important that I not sound like a bureaucrat here. And then the other part, to your point, has to be immediate and long-term thinking about how we deploy housing and shelter so that we can give people a safe place to be and give them resources and dignity.
And I think for me, and then I'm for real going to let you go. What I want to see is, in this temporary, God help us, let this be temporary. In this temporary state, make sure that people have access to restrooms, right?
Yes.
Have access to potable water.
Yes.
And just as you said, the ability
washing
to
their clothes, Wi-Fi. Why can't we get, you know, we did this,
exactly.
I know we're going to go. I know we got to go. We did this amazing project where we were able to use some infrastructure that was where it was to create free Wi-Fi, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we have so many areas missing in the city. So I want to find out if we can outfit a bus or some sort of mobile something.
Let's
to
do
add
it.
Wi-Fi in some locations. We got to do it. People
Let's
deserve to live in dignity. So,
yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
we'll stop.
All right. Well, you'll have to come back, Miss Latonda. And I do appreciate your time. I know you're busy. And so I appreciate you taking the time, and Amari as well, to come and talk to us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, you guys. Let me know. I'm happy to answer your questions when you have them in the future, okay?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye. So that was our acting homelessness director. Needs resources, not just resources for infrastructure, but also resources to make sure that people are not held accountable for this illegal dumping. I've literally witnessed construction companies dumping trash at encampments. I've witnessed people throwing mattresses out at encampments. So my thing is, as I've said before, as now this elected official who was formerly an organizer, working to change conditions from the outside, I want to see this humanity or a desire to improve the experiences of people, because it is governments and private industries that have created this crisis in the first place. And you have got to be maladjusted in this country, in this world, to actually make it through a day. And that is no shade. A lot of us do it. But can you just, the things that we have to just go through in order to get through a day, where now self-care is like a huge thing, because all of us, these are people who are just maintaining and holding on every single day. A lot of us are struggling, and some people can't do it. Some people cannot make it, and we have to care for each other. And I think one of the ways that we do that as elected officials and city staff like Latonda is we try to create the systems internally that are taking care of people that policy has stepped on, generation after generation. There's been bad policy that criminalizes people, that steals wealth, that makes it okay for corporations and the wealthy to grow their wealth while stealing from everybody on the bottom. And we got to change that. That's what I'm trying to do. So without further ado, I'm not sure if James Van is in the waiting room, but if he is, we're going to bring him up. And there he is, Mr. Van. I just want to start off by saying it's been 7 years ago now that we were having a meeting at a law firm in downtown Oakland. And it was Tanya Love, James Van, myself, and a couple other people. And we were talking about the city charter and some of the things that needed to change in order for us to pass some policy. And James is just rattling off, like, without reading anything, just the city charter. And I'm just like, okay, I want to be like you when I grow up. How do you know? How have you memorized that much of the city charter? It's just like amazing to me, the memory. But more so than your memory, it's your heart. And so, James, thank you for being with us to talk a little bit about your work around the unsheltered crisis in Oakland and what we need to do to get on the right track. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Madam Council Member. And I want you to know I'm deeply honored to be here tonight with two of the women that I just love.
Oh,
I love and respect you two so much. You're paragons of womanhood, leadership, and I just love you.
Thank you, James.
And I wish that both you and Ms. Simmons could have the kind of support that you really need to do those fantastic, amazing, and difficult jobs that you have to do. So I'm here sort of as a, as a wallfly or something that just bugs you to death. So I continue to do that, and I hope that's okay.
It is absolutely okay. That is the cornerstone of organizing. So I appreciate it. So okay. What can you share with us about this particular budget cycle? Some of the work that you're doing. Just grace us with your knowledge.
Okay. Well, I am a member of the Homeless Advocacy Working Group, and the working group started back in 2017, and it's been attempting in all that time to come up with working with the homeless. Homeless people are part of the, some 200 or so members who have joined the working group. And part of the what we hope to do is to change we work to develop policies that we think will help to address the city's tremendous problem of homelessness. And in the 4 years that I've worked with the working group, we have just come up against stonewall after stonewall after stonewall. There's just no real will that, there are a few people who feels the kind of sympathy and want to see problems solved with regard to the homelessness problem. But at the top, the leadership is just not present. They're absent. So we keep coming up with policy after policy, attempting to finally break through. One of the things I've been asked to do and will bring to the meeting tonight is the budget. The Homeless Advocacy Working Group has been meeting for over the last 3 months to put together a budget of what we feel would be needed to actually address the homelessness issue. Not as a long-term thing, but as an immediate thing. And because we think that's what's needed. Everybody says that, we need housing, get people into housing. And the Homeless Working Group also agrees with that. However, Oakland has 20,000 housing units sitting empty downtown. All those tall high rises that were built over the last three 3 years are sitting empty because the rents in those units are about $4,000 a month and up. And so they will never house the people who are on the streets, who have been pushed out of their lower rent apartments because the rents keep going up and up more than their incomes go up and more than they're able to pay. So ultimately, the rents get so high that they're pushed out onto the street. 82%, according to polls, of people who are on the street were formerly residents, had residential addresses in Oakland. And 70%, as you indicated, are African American who are on the streets. So that's a statistic that we really have to deal with. There was a lot of talk in the segment with Ms. Simmons about the encampment management policy. One of the things that the Homeless Advocacy Working Group vigorously opposed, because as you said, it is not a policy of getting people housed, but it's a policy, it's an anti-homelessness policy. It's a criminalization act. And we fought with some of our friendly council members to oppose this, and yet it passed unanimously. They said they voted for it because that gives them standing to bring it back up for reconsideration. We haven't seen that reconsideration yet. One of the things I do want to dispel before I get into the budget, we do talk about housing and homeless, and housing is what we need to get people off the streets and into housing, and that is true. However, that doesn't happen automatically. The City of Oakland does not build housing. Housing is built by the private market, since the federal government long ago abandoned public housing. There is no low-income housing being built. Of the 20,000 units now sitting vacant, only 75 units, which happened about 2.5 years ago in one of the developments, was designated to be affordable, which meant that a family of 4 had to make about $80,000 to qualify. And that's way above the average salary of people on the street. So none of those units, none of the 20,000 units that are built and more that are still coming online, will ever house any of our homeless population. And the City of Oakland does not build housing. So what that means, the Homeless Advocacy Working Group, who really have the goodwill, the future of the homeless people who are on the streets at heart, we have come up with a policy that we feel is needed to address the issue now. With approximately 10,000 to 12,000 people in the streets and living in vehicles, RVs, and so forth, and in tents and on the ground in Oakland today, there is no way the city can ever come up with 10 to 12,000 units of housing. The Section 8 waiting lists have been closed at the Housing Authority for some 3 years, so there's no help available for people on a long-term basis. The city they have put some people into housing, and their numbers, I think, would run something like about 300. But guess what? At least 200 of those they say they've put into housing are back on the streets in Oakland. So the city really has no program to address homelessness and to get homeless people into housing. The program that the Homeless Advocacy Working Group has come up with is, let's address the immediate need to get people off the streets into a facility where they're protected from the weather, where they can lock their door and be able to go out and take care of business and feel secure and come back and know that they won't be drowning in wet and cold weather at night, and they can begin to get settled, at which time we can begin to address all the other problems that they're facing, including getting them ready for housing. So we've come up with a solution that addresses people now, and we call it Accommodation Now. Accommodation Now is a program that will provide temporary transient housing facilities for people, which would be supplied through small houses, converted containers, rooms in hotels and motels, taking over abandoned buildings, buying up hotels, and putting people into them, getting people off the street and into a place where they have a roof, they have walls, they have a door they can lock. And once we do that and get people into that kind of situation, then we can begin to try to match people with the few units of housing that are available. So the budget that we have come up with is a budget that addresses these issues. And the budget we've come up with is one that's not cheap. It certainly is way above the $2 million the mayor usually appropriates for housing, for homelessness each year. But we feel that this is the kind of budget that would address the issues and the problem. The first thing is that there have to be sanitation provisions, sufficient sanitation provisions to take care of the health and human services that are just necessary. Porta potties, portable water, hand washing stations, large dumpsters for trash, sharps, needle containers, mobile shower trucks weekly at each of the 140, and as Latonda says now, there's estimated 150 encampments. But we feel that these are the kind of things, as long as people are on the street, those have to be assured. And we feel that that's going to run about $7.5 million to serve the 140, 150 encampments. Then we feel that there are habitability upgrades that are needed, getting tents off the ground with pallet platforms, tarps and insulation to help get through where there are open tents and through the weather, large tents for families, on-site storage facilities, and miscellaneous materials for walkways and maybe building storage rooms or additional rooms. We're for habitability upgrades, we estimated $368,000. Then we feel that the city needs to step away from these potting sheds that they call community cabins, because hardly any of the homeless people are willing to go into them, and they cost a lot of money. So we would like to see co-governed encampments. The working group has developed a policy regarding co-governed encampments. Each council district is supposed to designate areas where there might be a co-governed encampment. And so we have budgeted for about 10 of those co-governed encampments. And at about $3 million. The next thing in our budget would be the city presently requires each encampment to put up a $1 million liability policy. We feel that the co-governed encampments, which are more secure, more organized, are less risky, and we feel that the city ought to cover the insurance by putting a rider on the city's liability policy to cover the co-governed encampments, and we budgeted about $750,000 for city to add a rider that would cover the encampments. The next item has to do with transitional housing, getting more things that get people off the street. So we've pushed for the city to purchase the Lake Merritt Lodge, which FEMA has stepped in and has given the city money to do. There is also the Travelers Hotel that is still available. We would like to see the Travelers Hotel bought. We would like to see the city purchase hotels and motels that are sitting vacant and can be purchased now as another way to get people off the streets and into something closer to traditional housing. For these interventions, for the transitional housing, we budgeted about $6 million. Then we'd like to do some experiments, alternative shelter options. We'd like to see some small house villages put up, villages of tiny houses. Maybe an encampment that's made up of converted containers that can be stacked, and manufactured modular units or campuses. So we'd like to see the city fund 3 experiments to see how these types of facilities that have been tried and true in other areas can be worked out, and we budgeted about $3 million for that. For safe parking sites, we're city is being overrun now with RVs and trailers and people sleeping in cars. That's not going to go away. So we need to provide for services. We need to provide for safe parking camps, and we need to assist some of the people who prefer to live in their vehicles by getting getting their vehicles functional, helping them with registration and licenses and so forth. So for those activities, we've budgeted $900,000. And then for the last item in the homeless advocacy working group's budget, we have put in a homeless workforce program to begin to hire people so that people begin to develop a skill and ultimately are able to provide for their families and be in a position to move out into traditional housing. So for a workforce program, we've budgeted $2 million. The total of the budget that we feel would be necessary to address the situation now that protects people from the elements, preserves their dignity and respect, and gives them a place that they can begin to feel like it's their home. The budget will come to about $73,640,000 in the first year, $19 million in the second year, for a total of about $92 million over the 2-year budget period. Homelessness is not cheap. And we have to, a lot of people are on the street, and we have to put up money in order to be able to attack this problem in some way. Otherwise, it's just going to continue to grow. For the last year, homelessness has been increasing about 25% each year. So, and that shows no signs of stopping. So it's not a problem that we can close our eyes to and think it's going to go away. It's here for the long run. Happy to answer questions.
Thank you for sharing that, Mr. Van. And there are some questions in the chat. But while I get to those, I wanted to ask you, how does this approach, this, as you call it, Accommodation Now, how does that parallel with Housing First? Is it the same sort of approach where you give people housing first and then you address other issues later, or is it completely different?
It's different because Housing First is a slogan. It's not a program. Mm-hmm. The city has had that as their homelessness program for the last 5 or 6 years, and it does not produce housing. Housing First says that you've got housing that you can put people into. We don't have housing. We haven't built any housing. There is no way to build housing. It costs $600,000 a unit to build a unit of low-cost housing. So if we sit and keep, murmuring that housing first is our solution to homelessness in the city, it's a great idea, and it works only in areas where, one, the rents are low,
Mhm.
two, they have a very large vacancy factor, three, they don't have many homeless people, and four, they have a budget and supports to get people into those housing and give them a Section 8 certificate. None of those things apply in Oakland. We don't have any of those right now. So housing first is a pipe dream, and it hasn't produced anything for the 6 years that it's been the city's policy, and it's not going to produce anything. So that's why we've come up with the program of Accommodation Now to get people into an adequate accommodation while we try to address their social needs, the mental problems, abuse, substance abuse problems, or any, and get them ready for housing. So we think that people need a sense of dignity to be able to feel, and they also need us to have a sense of security, knowing that wherever they live, they are secure. They can lock a door, go to an appointment, and come back, and their things will still be safe. So we think that that's an interim step that's necessary while we try to figure out how to get the actual housing to put people into.
Thank you for sharing that. And I will take a couple questions. I see one from our acting homelessness director, Latonda Simmons, that says, what about the conversion of commercial properties to housing? What are your thoughts around that?
Perfectly. We just responded to a new program that the city is attempting to look at, and that is a way to make RVs legal. And so we're in favor of that. And one of the things we said is that the policy they're talking about right now, we'd like to see it expanded to include the purchase of vacant buildings, the purchase of commercial spaces that can be converted for housing use. We think every possible resource that's possible to acquire, to engender in some way, and it can be turned to helping to get people off the streets, we should do. So I'm perfectly aligned with that recommendation. Commercial spaces on an interim basis, yes, let's put people into even commercial spaces.
Thank you for that. I do see someone that's asking making a lot of statements. I'm not sure if they're well intended, but I think it's something that we should address. Like, if you stop the drugs, then you'll somehow stop homelessness. And the only reason that I'm even addressing those comments in the chat right now is because that's one of the arguments you hear from a lot of housed residents and others, like that drug abuse and drug use is causing homelessness. What would you say to that?
There's no question that many of the people on the streets are abusing substances or drinking, and I mean, these are people who've been put out of their housing. They don't have a job, or the jobs they have don't pay very little. They've actually lost a lot of faith and a lot of will for living, and in that situation, they become, almost a tool for people who are pushing drugs and alcohol and things like that. When people reach a point of hopelessness, they turn to alcohol and drugs. We think that substance abuse and mental issues are problems that need to be addressed. And if we can get people into a situation where they can begin to feel a little bit secure, then we can, the professionals who can service those kinds of problems can then begin to visit them and start to get them connected with services that will address those problems. But those problems are not just going to go away by themselves, and they're going to proliferate unless we do something to give people the will to want to leave that kind of life and get back into a traditional home and have a traditional family and so forth and so on. But we've got to give them that sense of security before we can even talk about their problems they're carrying with them.
And I would also argue that it is when people have stable places to live, then the drugs that they do use are less of a public nuisance, because there are a lot of our people in our daily lives that use drugs. Our doctors, teachers, pilots. There are a lot of people that use drugs that you wouldn't know because they get to shut the door behind them and keep their habits a secret. So what other people are allowed to do in the privacy of their own homes, unsheltered people can't do. And the level of despair that you do experience just with the stress of being unhoused is something where people do, if they haven't been before, sometimes turn to drug abuse. And that does not include the people who are challenged with mental health illnesses, that they actually need medication and self-medicate with what's available to them. So I think it's the collapse of many of our social safety net issues in terms of healthcare, access to medications, access to being able to rest efficiently. A lot of these things just signal to me a breakdown in our society versus just a question of individual morality.
You're absolutely right. And when people have lost hope and are at the sort of end of the line, they're perfect tools for the pushers to come in and take advantage of them. We don't deny that a large share of the people on the street are abusing alcohol or substances and who also have mental issues. But the beginning to address some of those is to get them into to stabilize their living situation. And that's what our Accommodation Now would hope to do.
And I definitely, if I have your permission and the permission of the Hog, would like to put up that Accommodation Now on my social media sites so people can see what it is.
Yes, please do.
Because I think people need to know that there's a proposed alternative. And
yes.
It's not just about the solutions to address the existing immediate shelter conditions of people who are living without shelter. We're also talking about our sewers and our access to waterways being obstructed and not having to invest money into those things, or the millions of dollars that go into protecting or ensuring the safety of our city workers who do the cleanups and the trash removal from encampments. If we had adequate housing and accommodation now, then we would also save money in so many different places that it would make this investment make sense. So it's more than just the immediate housing needs of the people who are living unsheltered, many of whom lived in addresses in the same zip codes where they found themselves to be unsheltered. It speaks to so many other things that would be addressed. And I have to lift up the public safety concerns, because you hear a lot about the uptick in violence, but what you don't hear is the increase in the homicides of unsheltered people in homeless encampments. A lot of those people go unnamed and unnoticed because they are homeless. And so when we're talking about public safety in Oakland and the need for increased public safety, we also have to talk about the people who are losing their lives through just being subjected to living in the elements, but also the people who are being preyed upon in these homeless encampments. And I think that's important to mention. There are a couple statements I want to say that I'm seeing in the chat. One from Ann Jane that says, in San Francisco, housing folks during COVID has actually increased folks' ability to seek and stay in substance abuse treatment. And they're having pharmacies deliver bupe directly to their rooms. And you can't do that without a home. I think that's important. Thank you for sharing that statement. And
Yes, thank you. That's a good statement. Great.
And there was also a comment I wanted to lift up from Yaya Thurman that says there are tons of vacant houses and apartments still left in Oakland. When are we going to see something done with that? And I will say that Yaya is the mother of the family that's on all of the Moms for Housing information. So you may have seen her face, but that is also one of the things that Moms for Housing really took a stand about, the number of vacant units. Something that you mentioned at the top of your statements earlier, Mr. Van. So I think that's important. So what are you suggesting be done around those? What did you say? 20,000 units in Oakland that are vacant?
20,000 new units in the high rises that have been built downtown. But we have 10 to 12,000 people on the streets. Now, it is true that there are a lot of vacant units in Oakland, especially in East Oakland and some in West Oakland, these were the properties that were the fallout from the 2008 recession that we had, where the bubble burst and a lot of people lost their homes through bankruptcies and so forth. HUD took all the properties that were being financed by FHA and Fannie Mae, and they bundled these houses that had come back to HUD through foreclosure. They bundled them in batches of 1,000 to 10,000 homes each, and they sold them to investors for pennies on the dollar. So there are a couple of very large investors who bought up thousands of these houses in Oakland. And it's true, as the person says, as Yaya says, that many of them are sitting vacant. The problem, however, is that the speculators who bought them are waiting for the market to pick up so they can sell them off and get richer again. But they are privately owned. The city does not own any of these houses. And the city, since redevelopment ended, the city has fewer ways of using eminent domain to take these houses away from people who own them. So unless one of the other things we're fighting for is to get money into the land trust, because the land trust can help to buy these properties. Hopefully, many of them, hopefully the sellers be willing to sell them, and the land trust can buy them, and we keep them out of the speculative market and get people into them. But that's a slow process. The city only began to capitalize the land trust 2 years ago. Last year, they put $12 million into the budget for the land trust, and that helped the land trust purchase a couple of buildings. But it needs to have a permanent capitalization from the city so that they can do more of that. But these are private homes, and that's the problem. We'd love to put people into them, but unless we find a way to take them away from the speculators who are now sitting on them, we're stymied there.
Thank you for that piece of information. And I have a deep connection to that work. But we are over time, Mr. Van. I want to give you an opportunity to have a closing statement. And then I want to close with something that I felt very inspired by in the chat. So take it away.
All right. Well, the Homeless Advocacy Working Group is continuing to try to move the city in the direction of helping people who are homeless to get into housing, but still to preserve their dignity and sense of worth, while we try to better the conditions that they find on the street. So we're happy to have you share the Accommodation Now policy on your platform, and we look for other people who want to be involved to help with the homelessness situation to come and join us, the Homeless Advocacy Working Group, and we'll just continue soldiering along as best we can and hope to get things improved a little bit at a time. Thank you.
Well, once again, James Van, former architect, current drum major for housing justice. I appreciate you for everything that you do, for your counsel, for your wisdom, and for your work. And I think what I wanted to lead with, and I'll just say a couple more things because Nancy Nadell said we need dumpsters instead of small trash cans with frequent emptying. It's easier for public works workers. Tanya Love said, why do we shame low-income people for engaging in the same behaviors that the wealthy engage in? I think those are all valuable. And those are just a couple of the things I wanted to end with. But most of all, I think please correct me, this Althoff, if I'm saying your name incorrectly, please text me or something, send me a message in the chat for how to pronounce it correctly. But Althoff Ali says, you cannot address hopelessness without hope. And so that I'm hoping that my presence on the city council and my work on the city council is actually helping to bring some of that hope. I meet regularly with unsheltered people in different encampments around my district. I'm working with my council members who want to stand up humane solutions today. The Accommodation Now, I completely agree with that sentiment. And I hope that I'm helping to bring a little bit of that hope. So with that said, I need your help. There's always ways to engage and tap in. Email us at district3, the number 3, at oaklandca.gov if you want to get involved. But once again, we got to keep on pushing. We're making headway. Things are changing because people like James Van, people like myself, and people like everyone that's tuned in to this event every other Thursday are pushing to make transformative change. And I appreciate you for that. And you will catch us here, not next week, but the week after that. And yeah, we got to keep fighting, keep pushing. Thank you all for joining us.
Love you.
Until soon.